Welcome on board the Rich Planet Starship, broadcasting from somewhere high above the Earth. I'm Richard D. Hall. Now, if you're going to attempt to try to understand world power, arguably the most important factor is oil. This week's guest is an oil field executive and is now a pioneer of the world truth movement. He has raised public awareness of corporate globalization, peak oil, and Codex Alimentarius, to name just a few. So without further ado, let's activate the teleporter and get him beamed up onto the ship. Ian R. Crane, welcome to the Starship.
Well, that was painless.
How are you?
I'm well, thank you, Richard.
So I said in the introduction there that you're a pioneer of the truth movement, and that's very much how I view you. Would you go along with that?
Well, it's very kind of you to say so, but no, I don't think so. I think probably at best, I would say I'm a sort of latter generation. Right. And I think the phrase pioneer really needs to be credited to the likes of probably Jordan Maxwell, Tex Mars, David Icke, right. Because these are the guys who were right out there at the forefront, taking all the arrows in their backs.
Right.
So, but fortunately, of course, I mean, events have moved on, and these guys have been proven, in my opinion, to be pretty much correct in some of their earlier assertions. And what's occurring now is that there is a mass political awakening, and I and many others are now part of, if you like, the next generation of people who are encouraging others to see what's really going on. Okay,
so we come on to the oil industry, Ian. You started life in the oil industry. Was that your first job?
No, not quite. Actually, by original qualification, my specialization, believe it or not, was military telecommunications.
All right.
But I didn't spend too long doing that. In fact, no time at all. I joined a company called Schlumberger in 1979, originally in the manufacturing side of the company. But not long after, I moved into the oil field services side. And Schlumberger is not a name that rolls off most people's tongue, but anybody who's worked in the oil industry or been closely associated with it will know the name Schlumberger. Schlumberger is the largest oil field services company in the world. It's actually, in terms of oil field services, it's larger than Halliburton. But it's not an American company, it's a truly transnational company, so it does have the opportunity to sort of work in places where Halliburton can't.
So how did you, or what led you to leave the oil industry then?
Well, in the first instance, I mean, I need to share an experience with you. I was one of the first civilians to go into Kuwait at the end of the first Gulf War.
Right.
Myself and a few other guys from the oil industry, we went into Kuwait to basically take a look at the logistical requirements that were going to have to be put into place to deal with the fires that had been set alight.
Yeah, I remember that on the news. All these oil wells were, smoking, on fire basically.
Yeah, it was. I mean, literally, it was like going into Dante's Inferno. I mean, it was horrendous.
Right.
I mean, I don't think anything could have prepared me for that experience. And of course, you will remember that the reason those fires supposedly were burning was because the retreating Iraqi troops had set them alight.
Yep.
But driving around the southern oil fields with our military escort, but it became very obvious to me that the official version of events was not supported by the physical evidence that I was witnessing firsthand. And that physical evidence was the phenomenal level of dead Iraqi troops lying basically around the wells, and it looked to me like they had been defending the wells, not setting them alight. So I happened to make this observation to the military escort that we had. They didn't say very much, but a couple of days later I was sitting down with my colleagues in the mess hall of the Kuwaiti oil company in Ahmadi in Kuwait, and this 300-pound gorilla in US battle fatigues made a beeline for me, and he walked straight over and he said, "You're Ian Crane?" And I didn't even get a chance to answer. He said, "I've been hearing you've been casting some aspersion about who set them wells alight." And I still didn't say anything. And he said, "Boy," he said, "that's the kind of thinking that can get you into a whole lot of trouble."
Really?
Anyway, I was just sort of gobsmacked. Right. But anyway, he turned around, walked away, leaned over his shoulder, and he said, "What the hell's the matter, Ian? Aren't we paying you enough?"
Right.
Well, to be honest, although here I am 19 years later, glibly telling you the story, I was absolutely crapping myself because I thought, oh God, what have I done here? What have I said? These guys have obviously lied to the world about what has happened here. I mean, if they're concerned that somebody's going to blow the whistle, and I really was very worried. I mean, up until I actually landed back in Dubai, where I was based. I mean, all the way through, I was just concerned that something, was going to occur. So I didn't really worry about it in the short term. I got on with the job, but as time wore on, and I learned more and more. Of course, I was already aware that April Glaspie had effectively given. She was the U.S. ambassador to Iraq, and that she had effectively given Saddam the green light to invade Kuwait, and so as I sort of learned more and more from information that wasn't available in the public domain, then obviously I became more and more concerned about the version of reality, or version of history in particular, that I thought was orthodox. And so over a period of years, I began to question more and more. And to be frank, by 5-6 years later, 1996, 97, I was, and funnily enough, I was about 40. So just at that time when you start to question everything in your life anyway.
Yes.
But that was the point at which I made the decision to get out of the oil industry.
All right. Now we come on to the term peak oil. I'm intrigued by this, Ian, because you promote this a lot. What does that term mean, peak oil?
Well, the term peak oil was effectively coined way back in the 1950s by a guy called Marion King Hubbard. He didn't like being called Marion, so he had everybody calling him King. But he gave a presentation in 1957 to the Society of Petroleum Engineers in Texas. And in that presentation, he presented the hypothesis that by the 1970s, America would no longer be self-sufficient in oil, and it would need to import oil. Well, after that presentation, he was immediately invited to become a member of the Club of Rome. And funnily enough, his prophecy appears to have come about, because in the 1970s, America started importing oil on a massive scale. In fact, the trigger point was 1973, which was, of course, the second of the Arab-Israel wars. But Henry Kissinger used that opportunity to hike the price of oil by 400%. And this was a deliberate ploy to establish a global economy based on the petrodollar.
Right.
Now, he was able to do this because a couple of years previously, on August 15th, 1971, President Nixon had removed the US dollar from the gold standard.
Right.
Now, if you want to create a global economy, what you've got to do is you've got to make sure that the people around the world have got the money to spend on your products. Well, the problem was that the US had products it wanted to sell, arms, but the other countries didn't really have the money. So Kissinger and James Baker III came up with this brilliant idea. And they said, well, look, we actually need oil. We've got all the oil we need. But instead of using our own oil, let's start importing oil. Because that way, we can actually get money into the global economy. And then those people will spend it with us.
Right.
So the only country they don't do that with is Israel, because Israel has nothing the US wants. So the US gives Israel $3.6 billion a year. But for all the other countries, it actually puts money into the global economy by buying oil.
America could have been self-sufficient if it had wanted to with oil.
Absolutely.
So they have reserves that they would not admit to, then, you think?
They have massive reserves.
Right.
Absolutely massive reserves. But I mean, it's almost an academic point, because had America been just using its own oil, then we would not have had the massive growth in consumerist materialism that we've seen over the last few years. And of course, neither would we have seen, by the way, the massive growth of a debt-based economy, which is effectively what has led us into the financial and economic mire that we see around the world today.
So peak oil is saying that the rate at which we are using oil is faster than the rate at which we're discovering it. Therefore, at some point, there will be none left. That's the basic principle.
That was the hypothesis. And that was...
You say that's completely and utterly flawed.
Absolutely. And it was accelerated again. The whole hypothesis of peak oil was reignited in the mid-90s by an Irish consultant to the oil industry by the name of Colin Campbell. Now, Colin was coming up to the age of retirement, and obviously something sort of kicked in his consciousness, and he decided to, effectively drag the Marion King Hubbard hypothesis out of retirement and presented this on a global basis. Now, at the time in 1996, some of the observations that he made were actually quite pertinent. I mean, he was absolutely right in what he said, in that we were using oil faster than we were discovering it. But that's a flawed statement, because to find something, you've actually got to look for it.
Yeah.
And what had happened is that through the 60s, 70s, and early 80s, there'd been so many massive discoveries that basically the oil industry decided that, really it didn't need to continue investing massive amounts of money in exploration, because we already had access to all the oil we were going to need for the next century or so. But the reality is that the growth of the developing economies, particularly India and China, certainly accelerated the demand beyond what had been initially anticipated.
Right.
But and what you also need to take into account is that such was the concern that we were running out of oil. Oil was actually $9.81 a barrel in 1999,
right,
which is too low.
Right.
I mean, it is too low a price. And consequently, the oil industry couldn't actually afford to reinvest and replace the infrastructure. Right. So what happened is, after 9/11, and with the invasion of Kuwait, and by the way, a big part of the invasion of Kuwait was to stop Saddam pushing his oil out into the open market at lower prices, because it's very important for the Americans to keep the oil price high. So with Colin Campbell's help, and another guy called Matthew Simmons and a few other fringe players, Mike Rupert came into the equation, the whole theory of peak oil and that we were going to run out anytime soon was pushed back into the public consciousness. But what's happened in the last sort of few years is, as the price of oil was pushed up and up and up, and of course it peaked in July of 2008, $147 a barrel, at the point at which the whole market crashed basically, and oil dropped from $147 in July of 2008, and it fell right back down to $35 in November, and now it holds at around about $75. But what was happening was all of this extra money was actually providing the oil companies with the money they needed, one, to reinvest in infrastructure, but more importantly, to reinvest in exploration. And in the ensuing years, I mean, we have now discovered enough oil. We don't have to really worry too much about where the oil is coming from, probably for the next 100 years or so. But let me add the rider. I am not for one moment suggesting that we should be continuing to build a hydrocarbon-based economy. I mean, it's not healthy for the world.
Yes.
It's not healthy for the global population. It's not healthy for the global economy. We don't need to be using oil anyway in the levels that we are. But we've also got access to very viable alternatives, but they're all suppressed by the oil industry.
Absolutely. Now you mentioned about the peak oil sort of scam, and the fact that America didn't bother or had a strategy not to exploit its own oil reserves so that it could create a global economy. I'm trying to get my head around that. Now, I have heard that the reason for the Gulf War, the second Gulf War, is because Saddam Hussein was going to stop trading his oil in dollars.
Oh no, not was planning to, did.
Right.
In fact, the moment.
So how would that affect America's plan for the global economy if he decides?
Oh, well, I can tell you exactly what happened. The moment that George W. Bush won the 2001 election, so in November of 2000, Saddam Hussein, because obviously he was still pretty annoyed at George Bush Sr.'s duplicity,
yes,
because Saddam believed that as an ally of the US, because bear in mind that the US had been providing Saddam with all the weaponry during the Iran-Iraq war. Of course, we now know that the US was also providing Iran via Oliver North and the Iraq-Contra affair. But Saddam believed that he was an ally of the US. And so when he was given the green light by April Glaspie to invade Kuwait, and then, of course, George Bush Sr. turned on him and effectively, evicted him, and then obviously manipulated sanctions against Iraq for the next decade. So Saddam was not best pleased. So he took the opportunity to get some retribution by, at the very moment that it was announced that George W. Bush had won the 2000 election, he immediately stopped trading his oil in US dollars and began trading his oil in euros. Now, even though he was restricted in the oil that he could sell, because he was only allowed to sell on the sort of oil for food program, but nonetheless, that amount of oil trading in euros rather than US dollars caused the US dollar to fall by 20% against the basket of international currencies. Now, you remember, of course, on, I think it was May the 5th of 2003, George Bush flew onto the USS Lincoln in flight, so very dramatic. And on the back, where he gave the speech that hostilities had ended in Iraq.
Accomplished.
Mission accomplished.
Yeah.
Mission accomplished. And of course, your average viewer thought what that meant was mission accomplished, we've effectively invaded Iraq, we're at Baghdad, Saddam is out of power. Not at all. What that statement was, it was a statement to the financial community saying that from this moment forward, Iraqi oil is now trading once again in US dollars.
All right, then, Ian. Okay, you heard it here, and we're going to go for a short break now, and we're going to talk more about how oil plays its role in world control. Don't go away.